Hey everybody, welcome to Hope Unabridged. I'm Angie Elkins.
And I'm Casey Brennan.
We are so glad that you have joined us today. We are talking today about marriage and ministry and transparency.
So good.
Yeah, it's good. It's good stuff. It's kind of an inside look into maybe what your pastor's life might be like.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, so I think we oftentimes put our pastors and maybe even their wives on a pedestal.
Yep.
And we think that they have a perfect marriage and they don't have any issues.
Yeah.
They don't have any problems.
We all have issues.
We all have issues, right? And so I'm excited because Ben and Lynley Mandrell are here today. And they are not pastoring a church currently. He is not right now. But so he's in a really interesting perspective to be able to talk about what it's like to be a pastor in a local church.
Yeah.
So
and they have a pretty great story of what they've been through. So.
Yeah, they really do. Ben and Lynley Mandrell believe ministry is a team sport. Married 20 years, they have served churches together in Tennessee and Colorado while raising their 4 kids, Ava, Max, Miles, and Jack. In 2014, the Mandrells felt the disruptive call of God and moved their family to Denver to launch Storyline Fellowship. What began as a Bible study in their house became a thriving church with 1,600 people packing into a renovated Walmart each week. During those 5 years, Ben and Lynley learned what it means to embrace risk and to live adventurously for God. In 2019, God interrupted their plans once again, calling the Mandrells to Nashville, where Ben serves as the 10th president of Lifeway Christian Resources. In 2021, Ben and Lynley launched The Glass House, a podcast hosted by Lifeway, where they have conversations with leaders who have experienced the stress of ministry. Ben and Lynley Mandrell, welcome to Hope Unabridged.
Great to be on the show. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Hey, I want to start. I've told everybody a little bit about who you are, but I didn't mention that you spent a little bit of time here in Orlando doing ministry. Why don't we start right there? Tell everybody what you were doing here.
Well, we planted a church in Denver, Colorado, but in order to do that, we needed churches to be behind us and help fund it and support us emotionally and spiritually. And First Baptist Church of Orlando was our sending church. So they were kind of took the primary responsibility for making sure we landed okay and had what we needed. So they asked us to do something that was unique. They said, rather than us just send you a check and say, we'll pray for you, what if you moved here for 5 or 6 months, allowed our church to get to know you so we could really send you out, like the Bible says, they laid hands on them and sent them out. And so we moved into the mission home there for 5 months. It was during January through May, which is the best time to be in Orlando.
Yes.
And we went to Disney World like 35 times with our 4 elementary school kids. So it was awesome.
Love that.
I love that. Recently, Lynley actually sent a picture to me of you guys and your kids on the platform at First Orlando. They were so small.
Oh.
Babies. I know. I mean, it's amazing how much they've grown since then. I mean, the time has flown. But yes, those months, everything that we brought could fit into 2 cars. And so it was kind of like tiny home living for 6 months for our family, and it was so fun. I mean, we had such a good time.
It was. We still tell a lot of stories from that 5-month time. Like a lot happened.
Yeah, I can imagine. Pretty concentrated.
We love your listeners. We love Central Florida.
Awesome.
It's pretty great. Yeah.
Yes.
So I love that you guys are here to talk a little bit about marriage and ministry. And I know you started a new podcast called The Glass House. So let's just start by talking about what is the Glass House?
Yeah, so we have heard that term before. People talk about that. And months ago, there was a church that asked us to speak on soul care. Well, at that point, we were kind of in a tough place in our own marriage and going through some marriage counseling. So we said, we are not the experts. We are just trying to achieve this. I mean, we're aspirational here. And so we spoke to them, to this church. And afterwards, we had a lot of response, a surprising number of response. So we were just walking one day. We said, it's an interesting, it's all these pastoral families are just living in this glass house where they are held at a standard that a lot of people aren't, just because their lives are on display. And so that's pretty much how we came up with the title and just said, what if we did a podcast and spoke to the other pastoral families and just said, hey, we get it. We see you and we understand what it's like to raise a family in the glass house or to have fights in your marriage in the glass house when other people know that that's happening behind the scenes. So that's basically it. I mean, what is your thought?
I think every occupation has its hazards. There's no easy job. All work is hard, but pastors have unique challenges, pastors and wives, and we don't talk enough about the wife. challenges she endures. We're trying to be an example for all these families. Our marriage is on full display. Our kids are on full display. We mess up a lot. We make a lot of mistakes. And sometimes people hold us to a standard that's higher than they hold to themselves. And so it feels hard for pastors and wives sometimes. And the more we get them talking about it, I think the less alone they feel.
So even our first Glass House episode it just said the glass house is fragile, because that's the idea behind it. I mean, glass is fragile. And so, it can be a really daunting task.
I would love for you guys to tell me a little about your planting journey and what was that like? Because I know there are probably some people listening that are planting churches with, being married, and that brings a lot of challenges. What was that like for your souls and your marriage, and how was that?
We're quick to say that pastoring an established older church is hard. It's got its own challenges of trying to change tradition and lean toward the future. So that's not an easy gig at all. But church planting definitely has a unique struggle in that so much of your identity gets put into the church. And it gets increasingly difficult to separate yourself from the work that you do on a daily basis in a church plant setting. So what we see with church planting couples, we saw it with ourselves, is the church becomes you. And as the church goes, so go you and your marriage and your family. And that's really an unhealthy way to live your life, because so many things that happen in church planting are not your fault.
Yeah.
I think about the church planters right now who launched right before COVID. That was not their fault, but they're dealing with a lot of struggles that they weren't dealing with before. So
I think a lot of the pressure in church planting that we don't talk about too is, and I'm not talking about small churches here, but in established churches, there is still a base of people who are giving, who understand that situation, the cost of a church. And so for our family, especially, we had 4 children, because a lot of church planners are newlyweds and they can get by on less. But I think he felt a lot of pressure. I mean, I'm the provider of this family of 6 in a really expensive part of the country. And so, we've got to bust our tails and make this happen. And so, I know there was times we even had discussions of, I would say, do we have to send out one more flyer? Like, we can't handle what's happening, the growth right now. Like, it's just the infrastructure wasn't in place before the growth happened. And, but you do, because you need people to come and you want them to come. I mean, because you're proud of what you're producing. So it's just kind of this vicious cycle of, well, we had to work hard because we had to provide for our family. And then we just didn't realize how hard we were working, and, we're losing ourselves in that.
Yeah. So speaking of that, I've heard you guys talk about kind of that treadmill of ministry. You're talking about that cycle that you get in, but you're working to manage this church and manage the growth of this church and bringing people in and winning them for the gospel. But all the while you have a marriage, right? Just like the rest of the world. And I've heard you guys talk about how that treadmill of ministry kind of prevented you from looking at your marriage. Will you talk a little bit more about that?
Which one of us do you want to start?
Well, you start and I'll chime in.
Well, I think one thing that was really hard is that, you work all during the week on stuff going on. And then on Saturdays, you have just a little bit of window of time. And for us, again, we had kids at home. You don't want to just be, fighting out some situations. And so we just began to form this pattern of sweeping it under the rug. Because you don't want to be fighting Sunday morning when you come in. I was working at the church. Most church planners are, but both spouses are working, just trying to make it happen. And so it just got to a point to where it's like, it's not worth fighting about, because we're not going to have it cleaned up by Sunday morning. And we don't want to come in with red eyes, of people, are you okay? And not knowing who to trust to say, well, I'm not okay. So that was a little bit of my story, but.
Well, I think intimacy is not the absence of conflict. It's working through conflict in a healthy way. And when the church is always full of conflict and there's struggles and difficulties at the church, you tend to take your own conflict and say, well, I'll get to that later. And what begins to build in your personal life is a pressure of, wow, the church may be going well, but our marriage, the temperature seems to be going up every day and it's going to hit a boiling point. And sometimes it would hit a boiling point and it all explodes on Saturday. And those are the hardest Sundays ever. People don't realize how hard it is to preach a sermon when your wife is on the front row and won't even look you in the eye.
Yeah.
Or says something like, "Hey, go ahead and preach the gospel, even though you're not living it." Right? You can just be like, just be snarky and sarcastic, and then he has to stand up there and preach the word of God, knowing, what's going on.
And you running the kids ministry, which is interfaced with lots of volunteers. And it's embarrassing when the pastor's wife comes with bloodshot eyes on Sunday morning because they've been up all night dealing with a conflict because it's the only time they can talk because the kids are always awake.
Right.
These are just some of the issues that pastors feel, but they don't talk about out loud because they feel like they're whining. The Glass House is, I think, giving them a place to say some of this stuff. And other people, we got a letter last week from a church planter's wife in Paris, France. And she said, it just was so encouraging to know I'm not crazy. I'm not alone. So this is a big part of our ministry now, is just helping pastors and wives feel like they're not alone. They got their stuff. We all do.
Yeah. What are some of those emotions that you all felt during that time? Was it a little bit of shame, or just, I don't know, what were those feelings that you were feeling?
All of them.
Yeah.
Well, I actually think we didn't have healthy words for that. I mean, we did a podcast recently and the guy said he was emotionally underdeveloped. And I think that we didn't even have words to put to how we were feeling. And so that's what has been so good for us, is that in our counseling journey, he's given us the words of, anger, hurt, fear, sadness, loneliness. There's 8 of them. And so that has been kind of the changing piece in our marriage, is that now we have words for it, instead of saying like, you make me so mad, or I can't believe you do this, or those kind of things.
I think a lot of it is generational. I really do. I think younger pastors are wanting to get more in tune with what's going on in their hearts. We did a talk the other night, and an older gentleman who's retired, who's a pastor, came up to me and he said, I just have to confess, like, I don't get all this stuff. Like my generation, we just suck it up and move on.
Yeah.
And I think as we're talking to more and more pastors, particularly those in their 30s, 40s, 50s, there's a desire now to kind of come back to who I am in my heart and not just keep stuffing the stuff down. So if I have fear, I want to know what to do with my fear, rather than just ignore it. And there's a lot of fear in marriage. We talk about in our counseling journey, we've learned how to say to one another. We said in the last 24 hours, I'm feeling afraid of you right now by what you're saying. Like that's scary. So learning how to speak the language of emotions it's a learned behavior, and I don't think it comes naturally to most pastors in life.
Yeah, I love
more people.
There's such a stigma around counseling too, I feel like. And I mean, my husband and I, we call them our check-ins. It's like getting your oil change, like every 5 weeks, that's what we do. And we're not ashamed of that because it has saved our marriage. But there is such a stigma around it. And I remember when we first started going, it was like, oh, you guys must really, really be bad. And maybe we were at the time. But can you talk a little bit about that and just how that has shed light on your marriage and how it's helped you guys grow?
I mean, I agree with that. I think that people only assume that if you go to counseling, you're at the end of the end.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really sad stigma. And I mean, honestly, even for our family, talking to our kids about us going has been a really good thing, because we want them to know, hey, when you get married, you're going to have problems. Like, it's not unavoidable. If you don't, then there's a bigger problem. I mean, somebody's avoiding something. And so we want them to know, hey, when you begin to get into problems, don't get to the lowest of the low. Like we let ourselves get to that point, and we regret it. I mean, that's what happened. Our marriage was just coming to the end. And so, yeah, we want it to be to where we can normalize it for people and say, do this sooner. I mean, we tell now church planning families that come to us for advice, like, you should do this from the very start. Because from the very start, it's going to take a toll on your marriage. People, like, we believed it would be the case that people who moved out with us would stay because they're going to be so happy and love the way we led the church. And that didn't happen. I mean, they didn't like the way we were doing things. And so it would have been good for us to process that with the counselor from the very start.
Yeah, I wish we could acknowledge that the word counseling has a lot of baggage. We've tried to think about other ways to talk about it, whether it's marriage coaching. I mean, everybody needs a coach.
A check-in. I like the check-in.
Yeah. I mean, the word counseling has a connotation of you're about to get divorced.
Right.
Rather than we're taking proactive steps to better love each other. I don't know that any pastor would say that it's harder to lead the church than it is to lead my wife. I think most would say the opposite. And yet we go to all kinds of coaches on how to grow our churches and do better at church. But if we admit that we're going to see somebody to help me be a better husband, it's like we're admitting defeat somehow.
Yeah.
And so we've actually looked into this. Most, like even state conventions in the Baptist world, provide 6 free sessions for the pastor and wife to go to counseling, and they tell me it's vastly underutilized. Very few actually use it.
Wow.
So we do need to change the way people think about counseling, because it's not what we think it is.
Yeah.
I think that's so good. Our church, even the church where my husband serves here in First Baptist Orlando, actually offers that as part of our just kind of maintaining our health and our wellness, as within our marriage and family, is that we can go to counseling whenever and however we need to. And I appreciate that as a pastor's wife, because you're right. It does have some unique challenges. I'd like to go back to your personal story a little bit. So you guys were called away from the local pastorate, serving your local church, into a new place where you are serving multiple churches, and you kind of got off that week-to-week treadmill, which is really what put you in the position to go, something's not right here. Can you tell us a little bit about the moment you arrived at realizing we need some help? Because I think our listeners will be able to maybe identify their place if they hear yours.
All those moments where Jesus is teaching and he has to get into a boat and push off from the shore to better speak to people. I think what happened for us after 17 years of being right there in the midst of people, coming to the job that I currently have, it allowed us to get into a boat and kind of push off and see our life from a distance a little bit, see our marriage from a distance. We also didn't have the every Sunday exposure like we had in ministry. My job is still very high profile in a sense, but not the same as standing up every Sunday before the same group of people and preaching a sermon. So we felt a certain level of freedom to say, there's been some things off. We keep having the same fight over and over and over. Maybe we can't figure it out ourselves. Maybe we need somebody to help us. And I think as we got to, it really took us getting to a low point in our marriage where we were both so frustrated before the pain was great enough that we said we need to get some help. And I'm glad we did, because it really was a journey back to healing for us. And it's continuing today. It's not complete by any means.
What did that low point look like for you, Lynley?
Well, I think I have a little different perspective from him on that, in that.
She's just more honest.
Okay. Yeah. So, when we moved here, I was really exhausted and was actually pretty excited to have a few months to just kind of chill, get our kids settled. They were in middle school and high school. That's a hard age to move kids. They did great. And he jumped right in to his work at Lifeway, and things were going great. People liked him being present, and he's a very sociable person. So I don't think even at that time we really understood the trauma that we had experienced leaving the church. I really saw it happen when COVID hit, and because he won't mind me sharing this. And when you're a preacher, you get a lot of affirmation, and then when you're coming into a company and they're excited for a new leader, you get a lot of affirmation. And then when COVID hits, and everybody's home and there's no affirmation coming in, and then it's kind of like a time to reevaluate. And I wasn't being able to do anything, out with people. So he and I were stuck inside the house together, and he was still working, but it was like, wait, who am I apart from the affirmation of people? Mm-hmm. And then that's when I think we kind of hit this critical new low of, well, was my identity all in storyline? Is his identity all in, being a personality that people like? Is what happens when he's not present. So I think that's when it took it to kind of a new low for us, and we realized we've got some issues individually that are causing us not to be able to have a solid marriage. It really wasn't, we both had our individual issues that we were portraying to the other person.
That's exactly right. And I think pastors are confessing that the pulpit has been a little bit of an idol for them.
Yeah.
It's been the place where they've received so much praise and encouragement that you take that away. What's left of me? I think those are really good questions that COVID forced pastors to ask about their identity. And they're still walking through that because their churches aren't the same as they were pre-COVID. Most of them aren't. And they're walking through the grief associated with that and the emotional work they need to do.
Sure. I love that. And I love your transparency. Why would you say, or can you talk to a little bit why transparency is so important, to be transparent about your work, your marriage, everything within the church?
I can speak to that in that two things for me. I don't like pretense. And so I think I don't want to pretend for anybody. We have some really great things in our marriage, and I can talk all about that, but we have some really hard things in our marriage too. And so I just think it's helpful to other people when they know that like we're not out here like pretending that we're great. And
It's good.
I forgot my second. I forgot my second. I'm sorry.
I love to read biography because biographers, they tell the real story about the person and not just what you read in the headlines. They tell the story about what was going on behind the scenes and the challenges. I mean, even songwriters, I love to read like the pain behind the song.
Yeah.
There's a lot behind a pastor besides good sermons. There's a lot behind a pastor besides growing a church. There's a lot that goes on. And as we've been upfront and honest about the pains, the struggles, the griefs, the sorrows, we're beginning to sense that this is a needed conversation for pastors. And that is who they are off field matters.
Yeah.
That was my second point, was that I love just the underrepresented. Thank you.
Yeah.
In that, you know, I mean, I think there's a lot of people that are underrepresented. And I think there's a lot of goodness today in social media of seeing all the people who are doing things wonderfully, but what about the ones that are struggling? And so that's for me has been the joy of this, is to see the emails come in and read them and say, you know, wow, we are making a difference to people who feel underrepresented and feel unseen and unheard.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know as of the time of this recording, you're about 15 episodes into your podcast. What have been some of your most maybe poignant moments or even things that have resonated with your listeners?
There's so many. Every guest we've had on has been transparent and real. And we've been encouraged to say, wow, you know, C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite quotes of his was, friendship is born the moment when you hear someone say or share something and you think, you too? I thought I was the only one.
Yeah.
And I think friendship is born that way. I feel like every time we have a guest on, I feel like we've just become friends because they share something. I thought I was the only one that felt that way. So the episode about fear, for example, or anxiety, you know, Dean and Sarah talks about there's moments where he feels his heart racing and he has to run to the hospital because he thinks he's having a panic attack. I just so appreciate a pastor like confessing that publicly and making it okay for other pastors out there who feel panicky sometimes or out of control. Those moments in the Glass House have been especially meaningful for me.
I think the one for me that has stuck out the most is David and Corone Loveless.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry. They had said, he spoke about the arrogance of capacity. And I had never heard that term before, but he just basically was saying, we cannot, you know, we have this arrogance that we can do it all. And I think that's what happened to Ben and I. That storyline was we had this arrogance of capacity, and we ended up, you know, it kind of came crashing down on us. And so his episode was about shame, and I thought that was really impactful. It stuck with me a lot. We have to say no. I mean, he and I even in the last 24 hours have said, are we going to have to say no to some things? Like, can we keep doing it all and raise children and teenagers who are, you know, they're hard ages now, teenage years, and they're making hard decisions, and they need some support from us.
You know, I think it's interesting that you guys are so willing to talk about your marriage and your struggles and your growth and things you've learned, because even for people who are not in the ministry vocationally, we do tend to look up to our pastors and their wives to a degree. And so to hear you guys going first and saying, hey, we have trouble sometimes, it's not just for pastors, right? It's for anyone who's struggling. I think it's a great just window into how you and Lynley have handled it, but also your guests and how they handle the different issues that they've dealt with. So it's great.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. We heard the definition of vulnerability of when you give someone enough information, they could hurt you with it.
Yeah.
And I do think because we're not pastoring a flock anymore, we have a little more safety in this conversation than a pastor does. If a pastor gets up in the pulpit and says, my wife and I are having problems, he does have to ask himself the question, what's the fallout? You know, what price am I going to pay for saying that? Even though half or 3/4 of the couples in there would leave saying, I'm so grateful we're not the only ones with our struggles in our marriage. I think pastors weigh that cost and they're afraid to be vulnerable. But we need for pastors to be as vulnerable as they can be.
Yeah. Amen to that. Well, this conversation has been so great. We ask all of our guests one final question, and that is, where are you finding hope these days? I'd love to hear from both of you on this one.
Yeah. We're finding hope in our kids. So we have worked really hard to raise these 4 kids, and they're all like in the high school age now. Our youngest one's moving into high school. We're really proud of our kids. They're not perfect by any means, but we're seeing progress. One of our sons just wrote an essay for school, and he wrote about what he learned while he was a church planter's kid. And we were blown away that he actually learned those things because he's never spoken them. And so it gives us a lot of hope that all these years, like, parenting is an act of faith.
Yeah.
You give it your best shot, and then you just hope and believe that they're going to stay true to what you taught them. And we're seeing a lot of great things in our kids right now. We started a practice in our home as regularly as we can of having what we call a nightly closer. And everybody gets a feelings wheel. And you have to share,
I love it.
Everybody has to share one feeling from the feelings wheel. And our teenage boys, like, they're sharing like real feelings. And
wow,
it's encouraging to see growth in them.
They're sharing it because they see it in front of you. I mean, if I say, how was your day? It was good. It's so short like that. But when they can see it in front of them and they can identify one, that's why they're doing it.
That is a great idea.
It is. It's awesome.
You didn't answer.
I didn't answer. For hope, for me, I'm in a hopeful season because for much of my adult life, I have felt insecure next to him. I mean, he has his doctoral degree and master's degree and all those things. And I've always felt really less intelligent, less spiritual. But I read the Bible. I read a book called Praying the Bible just recently, and it just talks about praying through the Bible. And I have found a lot of hope that I can re-energize my prayer life because I can feel stagnant in it. And I feel really just insecure about it. People have high expectations on I'm the president's wife at Lifeway. I certainly have great biblical depth, and so I can feel insecure with that. And so having a resource like that has helped me really learn how to not just pray, Lord bless our kids, but like really pray through the scriptures has been really helpful for me this year. And
it's good.
Yeah. It's great.
I love it. Well, thank you both. Thank you so much for sharing and being transparent.
Well, we love your show. We love spreading hope. The world needs a lot more of it right now.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Thanks for coming on, y'all.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Hey,
thanks for having us.
Thanks so much for joining us today on Hope Unabridged. We'd like to remind you, if you're watching us on Good Life 45, you can also listen to these episodes everywhere you listen to podcasts.
If you're listening and you would like to see the filmed version of this show or any of our other shows, check us out on Good Life 45 or on our YouTube channel or our app.
We hope that something you've heard today really blessed you, and we would love for you to share the show with those you love. So just hit that share button on your podcast app or on YouTube, send it to a friend, and we would also love it if you would leave us a review. With this program, we are finding hope in the unedited stories of our lives, and we want you to do the same.